Jake Morrison stepped off the transport ship and looked around the massive space station. Concordia Prime was bigger than any human city he had ever seen. The walls stretched up so high he could barely see the ceiling. Thousands of aliens walked through the wide hallways, talking in languages he did not understand. He had been chosen to represent humanity in the Galactic Federation. It was supposed to be an honor. Jake had served in the human colonial fleet for 15 years. He had fought pirates and rescued colonies. He thought he knew what real leadership looked like, but nothing had prepared him for what he found at Concordia Prime. The Federation was supposed to keep peace between the different alien races. Jake had read all the reports before coming here. The Federation had rules about trade, about borders, about how conflicts should be solved. It all sounded very organized and fair on paper, but reality was different. Jake's first meeting was with Ambassador Krell-Tech of the Regellian Republic. The blue-skinned alien had large eyes and spoke in a soft voice. He seemed nervous as he explained how things really worked. "You must understand, Commander Morrison," Krell-Tech said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "The Federation operates on what we call practical diplomacy. The Kethver Empire and the Zephyrian Collective control most of the votes. If you want anything done, you must make deals with them first." Jake frowned. "What kind of deals?" Krell-Tech pulled out a small device and showed Jake a list of numbers. Trade privileges, mining rights, military contracts. Sometimes just pure credits transferred to the right accounts. Nothing gets voted on without proper arrangements being made first. This was not what Jake had expected. What about the Federation? Charter? What about protecting smaller worlds and maintaining justice? The Regellian laughed, but it was not a happy sound. Justice is whatever the Kethver and Zephyrians say it is. The rest of us just try to stay out of their way. Jake's real. Education began during his first Federation Council session. The council chamber was enormous, with seats for representatives from over 200 worlds. But Jake noticed that only about half the seats were filled. Many of the smaller species had stopped sending representatives years ago. The Kethvar. Ambassador Sektar Voss sat in the center of the chamber. He was a large reptilian creature with dark green scales and yellow eyes. His voice carried across the room without any electronic help. The Zephyrian representative, Hivemind Zexka, was different. The insectoid alien's body was thin and tall, with 4 arms that moved constantly as it spoke. Jake listened as they discussed trade disputes and border disagreements. Everything was handled through committee meetings and subcommittee reviews. Simple problems took months to resolve. Complex issues were delayed for years. Then the emergency alert came in. A transport ship carrying Altarian refugees was under attack by pirates near the Outer Rim. The ship had over 800 civilians on board, including many children. They were fleeing a civil war on their home world and had no weapons to defend themselves. Jake stood up immediately. "We need to send a rescue fleet right now. There are Federation patrol ships only 2 hours away from that location." Sektar Voss turned his yellow eyes toward Jake. "Honored human representative, you are new here. You do not understand our procedures. We cannot simply send military vessels without proper authorization." Authorization? Jake could not believe what he was hearing. There are children dying out there right now. Hivemind Zexka made a clicking sound that Jake learned was laughter. The transport ship should have requested proper escort services before entering that sector. This is an unfortunate but necessary lesson in following protocols. Other representatives nodded in agreement. A few looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. Jake looked around the chamber. "So we're just going to let them die because they didn't fill out the right forms?" "We must form a committee to study the situation," Sektar Voss said. "Then we will make recommendations to the Security Council. If they approve, We can begin planning a response. How long will that take? Perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. These things cannot be rushed. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. 3 or 4 weeks. The refugee ship would be dead in 3 or 4 hours. He watched as the council moved on to their next topic, a debate about new regulations for cargo manifests. The aliens discussed paperwork while people died in space. Jake had seen corruption before, and he had seen cowardice. But this was something worse. This was organized indifference. That night, Jake sat in his quarters and stared at the communication device on his desk. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew it would end his diplomatic career before it really started. He opened a secure channel to the human frigate Defiance, commanded by Captain Lisa Carter. Lisa was an old friend from his fleet days. She was tough, smart, and had never backed down from a fight. "Lisa, I need a favor," Jake said when her face appeared on the screen. "What kind of favor?" Lisa asked. She could tell from his expression that this was serious. "There's a refugee ship under attack near Grid 77 Alpha. The Federation won't help them. Can you get there in time?" Lisa was quiet for a moment. "That's outside our patrol zone, Jake. And if the Federation isn't involved, this could cause problems." 800 civilians, Lisa, including kids. Lisa nodded. "We'll be there in 90 minutes. But you know this is going to cause trouble for both of us." "I know." The rescue was successful. The Defiance and 2 other human ships drove off the pirates and escorted the refugee transport to safety. 847 Altarians lived because humans decided to act instead of talk. But Jake was right about the consequences. 3 days later, he stood in the same council chamber. But this time, he was the one being put on trial. The charges were serious: unauthorized military action, violation of Federation space law, and endangering diplomatic relations. Sektar Voss spoke for the prosecution. The human representative has shown complete disregard for proper procedures. His reckless actions could have started a war. What if the pirates had been working for a Federation member? What if the refugee ship had been carrying illegal cargo? Commander Morrison did not wait to find out. He simply acted on emotion instead of logic. Jake was allowed to defend himself. He stood up and looked around the chamber at all the alien faces staring at him. "You're right," he said. "I did act on emotion. I felt something when I heard about those children trapped on that ship. I felt something that told me we had to help them, even if it meant breaking rules." He paused and looked directly at Sektar Voss. "On my world, we have old stories about warriors called knights. They lived by a simple code: protect the innocent, defend the weak, and never abandon those who trust in you. These knights would ride into danger to save people they had never met. They would risk everything for strangers." Some of the aliens in the chamber made sounds that Jake learned were expressions of amusement. "You think that's funny?" Jake continued. "You think caring about innocent people is primitive? Maybe it is. Maybe humans are too emotional and too quick to act. But at least we act. At least we try to help." He looked around the chamber again. "You have created a system where it takes weeks to save dying children. You have made bureaucracy more important than human life. You call this civilization, but I call it cowardice." The chamber erupted in angry voices. Several representatives demanded that Jake be expelled from the Federation immediately. Others called for economic sanctions against human space. But Jake noticed something else. Some of the representatives from smaller worlds were looking at him with expressions he had not seen before. Hope, maybe, or recognition. The trial lasted 3 more days. Jake was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to expulsion from Federation space. But by then, it did not matter. His speech had been broadcast across human space, on dozens of worlds. People had heard a human representative stand up to the galaxy's most powerful empires and speak about honor and courage. Something had awakened in the human colonies, something that had been sleeping for a long time. Jake Morrison had no idea that his words would start a revolution. He only knew that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than following the rules. The Age of Knights was about to begin again. Jake Morrison's words spread across human space faster than any government message ever had. Within hours of his trial, every human colony had received copies of his speech. People gathered in bars, meeting halls, and family homes to watch the recording of their representatives standing up to the galaxy's most powerful empires. On New Texas, a farming colony near the edge of human space, Rancher Pete Johnson watched the speech 3 times before he made his decision. Pete had been fighting off pirate raids for years with nothing but a few old mining lasers and the help of his neighbors. The colonial government always promised to send patrol ships, but they never came. "Mary," he called to his wife, who was feeding their chickens in the yard, "get on the comm and call the other ranchers. We're having a meeting tonight." Mary Johnson looked up from the chicken feed. What kind of meeting? The kind where we stop waiting for someone else to protect us. That evening, 47 ranchers and farmers crowded into Pete's barn. Jake Morrison's speech played on a portable screen while the colonists discussed what they had heard. "He's right about one thing," said Carl Weber, who owned the biggest cattle ranch in the sector. "Nobody's coming to save us. The Federation doesn't care about places like New Texas, and our own government is too busy making trade deals to worry about pirates. So what do we do?" asked Jenny Mills, a young woman who had inherited her family's farm after pirates killed her parents. Pete stood up and walked to the front of the barn. "We do what this Morrison fellow talked about. We protect each other. We protect the innocent. We make it so pirates think twice before coming to our sector." Within a week, the New Texas Protection Volunteer Group had 30 ships. They were not military vessels, just converted cargo haulers and mining ships with weapons bolted to their hulls. But they were crewed by people who had decided to fight back. Their first mission came 2 weeks later. A family transport from the Centauri colonies sent a distress call while being chased by 3 pirate ships. The colonial patrol fleet was 6 hours away. The volunteers were 30 minutes away. Pete led 5 ships to intercept the pirates. His own vessel was a converted grain hauler called the Longhorn. It was not fast or pretty, but it had thick armor and 4 missile tubes that Pete had installed himself. The pirates expected easy prey. Instead, they found themselves facing farmers who flew their ships like they drove tractors through asteroid fields. The volunteers lost 2 ships, but they saved the transport and destroyed all 3 pirate vessels. Word of the victory reached other colonies quickly. Soon, similar volunteer groups were forming everywhere humans lived. On Europa Station, Engineer Kate Sullivan watched the reports of civilian ships fighting pirates with equipment that barely worked. She had spent 10 years designing military vessels for the colonial fleet. She knew how to build ships that could fight and survive. Kate called together her engineering team at Stellar Dynamics Corporation. "We're going to design a new kind of ship," she announced, "not for conquest or trade, for protection." Her chief designer, Danny Brooks, looked confused. "The military already has patrol ships." "Not like this," Kate said, pulling up a holographic display. "Look at what these volunteers are trying to do. They need ships that are fast enough to respond to emergencies, tough enough to fight pirates, and cheap enough that colonies can afford them." Kate's team worked for 3 months to create what they called the Knight-class patrol ship. It was smaller than a military frigate, but carried more weapons than most pirates could handle. It was designed for speed and rescue operations, with large cargo bays for evacuating civilians and medical facilities for treating wounded. The first Knight-class ship, the Galahad, rolled out of the shipyard 6 months after Jake Morrison's trial. Within a year, Stellar Dynamics had orders for over 200 more. But the most important changes were not happening in space. They were happening in the human mind. Dr. Alan Foster had been a history professor at Earth University for 20 years. He specialized in medieval culture and had written several books about knights and chivalry. After Jake Morrison's speech, Dr. Foster received hundreds of messages from people asking about the old codes of honor. People want to know if the stories are real, Dr. Foster told his colleague, Dr. Rebecca Stone, as they walked across the university campus. They want to know if knights really lived by those principles. What are you telling them? Dr. Foster stopped walking and looked up at the sky where transport ships moved between Earth and the orbital stations. I'm telling them the truth, that honor and courage are not just old stories. They are real human traits that helped our species survive for thousands of years. Dr. Foster began research that would change how humans understood themselves. He studied brain scans, genetic patterns, and psychological profiles. What he found surprised even him. Humans were different from other species in specific ways. They had stronger emotional responses to the suffering of strangers. They were more likely to risk their own lives to save others. They had an unusual ability to form loyal bonds with people outside their immediate family groups. It's not just culture, Dr. Foster explained in his research paper. It's biology. Humans are hardwired to be heroes. Other species have this trait, too, but not as strongly. That's why the Federation finds our behavior so strange. His paper, called The Science of Human Heroism, became required reading in every human school and military academy. It explained why Jake Morrison felt compelled to save those refugees. It explained why Pete Johnson organized his volunteers. It explained why humans could not just sit back and watch injustice happen. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison was having adventures of his own. The Federation had ordered him to leave their space within 30 days, but that turned out to be more difficult than expected. The Altarians remembered that Jake had saved their people. When Federation security tried to arrest him at a spaceport on Altair Prime, thousands of refugees surrounded the building. They would not let the security forces through. This human risked his career to save our children, said Elder Veltar, speaking for the Altarian Council. We will not allow him to be harmed. With Altarian help, Jake escaped Federation space and made his way back to human colonies. But he found a very different place than the one he had left. Everywhere he went, Jake saw signs of change. Ships were painted with symbols that looked like old Earth Knight emblems. Volunteers wore patches with names like Solar Templars and Void Guardians. Young people talked about codes of honor and protecting the innocent on the mining world of New Avalon. Jake attended a meeting of the local volunteer group. They called themselves the Stellar Paladins, and they had 37 ships protecting merchant traffic in their sector. We heard your speech, Commander, said their leader, a former mining foreman named Chuck Adams. You reminded us what we're supposed to be fighting for. Not just human interests. All innocent people, no matter what species they are. The Stellar Paladins had recently rescued a Regellian science ship from pirates. They had also stopped a Kethver military unit from bombing a civilian station during a trade dispute. The Federation had filed protests about both actions, but the volunteers did not care. Let them protest, Chuck said. We're not hurting innocent people. We're protecting them. If that makes us criminals in their eyes, so be it. Similar groups were forming throughout human space. The Solar Templars operated out of the Alpha Centauri system. The Void Guardians protected the shipping lanes near Earth. The Star Knights patrolled the frontier colonies. Each group developed its own traditions and methods, but they all followed the same basic principles that Jake had talked about in his speech. Protect the innocent. Defend the weak. Stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they were. The Federation tried to stop the movement by imposing trade sanctions on human worlds. The Kethver Empire threatened military action if the honor fanatics did not disband. The Zephyrian Collective began moving warships toward human space, but it was too late to stop what had started. Dr. Foster received a message from Jake Morrison 3 months after his return to human space. Jake was on the colony world of Avalon, where representatives from 12 different volunteer groups were meeting to coordinate their efforts. "Doctor," Jake said over the comm channel, "I think we need to make this official. These groups are doing good work, but they need better organization. They need a common code to follow. They need to become something more than just volunteers." Dr. Foster understood what Jake was asking. You want to create a real knighthood. Not just people playing at being medieval warriors, but a genuine organization based on those principles. Exactly. The galaxy laughed at the idea of honor and courage. But humans have proven that those things still matter. Now we need to show them what a civilization based on those values can accomplish. Dr. Foster began working on what would become the new chivalric code. It would be simple enough for anyone to understand, but comprehensive enough to guide the actions of thousands of people across dozens of worlds. The Age of Knights was no longer just beginning. It was about to become real. As Jake looked out at the stars from his temporary quarters on Avalon, he thought about the refugee ship that had started everything. The colony world of Avalon had been chosen for a reason. It was far enough from Federation space to be safe from interference, but close enough to the major shipping lanes that representatives from all the volunteer groups could reach it easily. The planet itself was beautiful, with rolling hills and clear blue skies that reminded many humans of ancient Earth. Jake Morrison stood on the balcony of the colonial governor's mansion and watched ships arriving in the sky above. In the past week, vessels from 12 different volunteer organizations had landed at the spaceport. Each group had sent their best leaders to this meeting that would change everything. "Nervous?" asked Kate Sullivan, joining Jake on the balcony. She had arrived 2 days earlier with plans for the newest Knight-class ships and a proposal that would revolutionize how the volunteers operated. "A little," Jake admitted. "6 months ago, I was just trying to save some refugees. Now we're talking about creating something that could challenge the entire galactic order." Kate smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. Inside the mansion, representatives from the volunteer groups were getting to know each other. Pete Johnson from the new Texas Protection Group was comparing notes with Commander Sarah Blake of the Solar Templars. Chuck Adams from the Stellar Paladins was discussing rescue techniques with Captain Monica Torres of the Void Guardians. Despite coming from different worlds with different backgrounds, they all shared the same basic values. They had all decided that protecting innocent people was more important than following rules. They had all risked their lives and their fortunes to stand up against bullies and pirates. Dr. Alan Foster arrived on the 3rd day with a document that he had been working on for months. The new chivalric code was only 3 pages long, but it contained everything the volunteer groups needed to work together effectively. "Keep it simple," Dr. Foster explained to the assembled representatives. The old knights succeeded because their code was easy to understand and remember. Protect the innocent, defend the weak, speak truth to power. Never abandon those who trust in you. The code also included practical guidelines for cooperation between groups, rules for sharing resources, and standards for training new volunteers. Most importantly, it established the principle that no single leader would control all the groups. Each organization would maintain its independence while working toward common goals. Jake was elected as the first Knight Commander, a position that was more about coordination than command. His job was to help the groups work together and represent their interest to outside governments and organizations. The Conclave of Orders, as the meeting came to be known, lasted for 2 weeks. By the end, they had established communication networks, supply agreements, and joint training programs. They had also created a new symbol that would become famous across the galaxy. A simple star surrounded by a circle, representing the light of hope protected by those who chose to defend it. But the real test of their cooperation came sooner than anyone expected. 3 weeks after the conclave ended, the Zephyrian Collective launched what they called a pacification campaign against the miners on Kepler 442b. The miners had been on strike for 6 months, demanding better working conditions and fair wages. The collective had decided to end the strike by force. The Federation refused to intervene. Ambassador Sektar Voss made a statement saying that this was an internal collective matter and that outside interference would be inappropriate. The fact that Zephyrian troops were preparing to attack civilian mining stations did not seem to concern the Federation Council. Jake received the distress call from the miners' union leader, a tough woman named Helen Carter, who had spent 30 years working in the asteroid mines. "Commander Morrison," Helen said over the emergency channel, "I know you don't owe us anything. We're not even human. But we've got 12,000 miners on this rock, and the collective is bringing in warships to bomb us into submission. Our families are here, our children. We've got nowhere else to go." Jake looked at the tactical display showing Kepler 442b. The mining asteroid was in collective space, far from any human worlds. Getting there would require 3 different volunteer groups to work together, and they would be badly outnumbered by collective forces. But the decision was easy. "We'll be there," Jake told Helen. "Hold on as long as you can." The response was immediate. Captain Ryan Blake volunteered to lead the Solar Templars into battle. Commander Amy Chun of the Star Knights agreed to coordinate civilian evacuations. Chuck Adams brought the Stellar Paladins to provide heavy fire support. The 3 groups had never worked together in combat before. They had different ships, different tactics, and different communication systems. But they shared the same commitment to protecting innocent people. The battle for Kepler 442b began badly for the volunteers. The Zephyrian Collective had brought 30 warships, including 2 heavy cruisers that outgunned anything the humans had. The volunteers had only 14 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels with improvised weapons. Ryan Blake's flagship, the Excalibur, led the attack on the Collective's orbital platforms. The Solar Templars specialized in fast strikes against heavily defended targets. They had learned their tactics fighting pirates who liked to hide behind asteroid bases and space stations. "All ships, this is Blake," Ryan announced over the com channel. "Remember, we're not here to win a glorious victory. We're here to buy time for the evacuations. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and get out before they can surround us." The Solar Templars struck like lightning. Their ships dove through the collective formation, launching missiles and firing energy weapons at the command ships. The surprised Zephyrians lost 3 vessels in the first attack, but they quickly regrouped and began pursuing the human ships. Meanwhile, Amy Chun was coordinating the most complex rescue operation in volunteer history. The Star Knights had brought 12 transport ships to evacuate the miners and their families. But getting those transports to the asteroid surface, while a space battle raged overhead, required perfect timing and coordination. "Transport 7, you're clear for landing at Mining Station Delta," Amy announced from her command ship, the Lancelot. "Transport 3, hold position until the Zephyrians move their patrol ships away from the South Pole." The evacuation took 6 hours. The volunteers managed to rescue over 9,000 miners and their families, loading them onto transports that immediately jumped to safety in neutral space. But the cost was high. Chuck Adams, and the Stellar Paladins fought a desperate, holding action against the collective cruisers. Their ships were designed for patrol work, not battles against heavy warships. The Paladin flagship, the Galahad, took severe damage while protecting the evacuation transports. The moment that defined the battle came when Chuck realized that one of the collective cruisers was moving to attack the civilian transports. The Galahad was badly damaged and could barely maneuver, but it was the only ship in position to intercept. "All hands, this is Adams," Chuck announced to his crew. "We're going to ram that cruiser. It's the only way to stop them from reaching the transports. Anyone who wants to evacuate to the escape pods has 60 seconds. Only 12 of the Galahad's crew of 200 used the escape pods. The rest stayed at their posts as Chuck drove the damaged ship directly into the collective cruiser's engine section. The explosion destroyed both vessels, but it also disabled the cruiser's sister ship and gave the transports time to escape. The Battle of Kepler 442b lasted 14 hours. When it was over, the volunteers had lost 6 ships and over 300 people, but they had saved 12,000 miners and their families from certain death or slavery. More importantly, they had proven that the volunteer groups could work together effectively against major galactic powers. The victory sent shockwaves across the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, someone had successfully challenged the Kethfer Empire and Zephyrian Collective and won. The footage of human volunteers sacrificing their lives to save alien miners was broadcast on every independent news network. The political consequences were immediate. The Altarian Republic officially withdrew from the Federation and requested protection from the Night Orders. The Regelian Council followed suit 2 days later. Within a month, 17 different species had abandoned the Federation's protection in favor of the human volunteers. But the most important changes were happening among the volunteers themselves. Jake Morrison stood in the Memorial Garden on Avalon, reading the names of the people who had died at Kepler 442b. Chuck Adams's name was carved in black stone, along with the names of his crew and the other volunteers who had given their lives. "They knew the risks," Kate Sullivan said, joining Jake among the memorial stones. "They chose to go anyway." "That's what makes them heroes," Jake replied. "Not that they died, but that they chose to risk everything for people they had never met." The volunteers were no longer just civilian groups trying to help their neighbors. They had become something new, something that the galaxy had not seen for a very long time. They had become true knights, willing to sacrifice everything for the ideals they believed in. Dr. Alan Foster had predicted this transformation in his research. The war began without warning on a Tuesday morning. Jake Morrison was reviewing supply reports in his office on Avalon when the emergency alerts started coming in. 3 human colonies were under attack simultaneously. New Geneva was burning under Kethfer bombardment. The mining station at Ross 128 had gone silent after Zephyrian ships surrounded it. Most shocking of all, a massive enemy fleet was approaching New Camelot, one of humanity's most important agricultural worlds. "It's coordinated," Kate Sullivan reported as she burst into Jake's office with a tactical display. "They hit us at our weakest points, while most of our night ships are scattered across the galaxy on rescue missions." Jake studied the numbers and felt his heart sink. The enemy had planned this perfectly. New Camelot had 2.3 million human colonists and almost 500,000 refugees from dozens of different species. The planet produced food for 30 other worlds and housed the largest refugee resettlement center in human space, and it was defended by exactly 8 Night Order vessels. The attacking fleet had 50 ships, including 12 heavy cruisers and 2 massive dreadnoughts. The Kethfer Empire had committed more firepower to this single attack than they had used in their last 3 wars combined. Commander Troy Adams commanded the defense of New Camelot from his flagship, the Excalibur II. Troy was Ryan Blake's younger brother, and he had taken command of the Solar Templars after Ryan died in a pirate raid 6 months earlier. He was only 28 years old, but he had already fought in a dozen battles. This is Adams to all Night Order vessels. Troy broadcast on the emergency channel. We have enemy contact, 50 ships inbound to New Camelot. We are outnumbered. 6-1. I am requesting immediate assistance from any available forces. The response came from across human space. On New Texas, Pete Johnson was loading his converted cargo hauler with every weapon he could find. On Europa Station, retired military officers were volunteering to crew any ship that could fly. Even on Earth itself, civilian captains were converting their vessels for combat, but Jake knew that help would not arrive in time. New Camelot was 3 days from the nearest major human world by the fastest ships available. The enemy fleet would reach the planet in 18 hours. Troy Adams knew this too. His message to the Night Orders became one of the most famous broadcasts in human history. To all Night Order vessels, this is Commander Adams aboard the Excalibur. 2. We are 8 ships against 50. The mathematics are simple. We cannot win this battle by any normal definition of victory, but we will not abandon the people of New Camelot. We will not let them face this alone. Troy paused, looking out at the enemy fleet approaching his world. If we must fall, let it be known that we stood for something greater than ourselves. We stood for the innocent. We stood for the idea that courage matters more than numbers. We stood for the belief that some things are worth dying for. The 8 night ships formed a defensive line between the enemy fleet and New Camelot. They were vastly outgunned, but they had advantages that the Kethfor commanders did not understand. They were fighting for their homes and their principles. They knew exactly what they were fighting for, while the enemy was fighting for abstract concepts like political control and galactic dominance. The battle began at dawn on New Camelot time. The Kethfor fleet opened fire with long-range missiles. While still 2 hours away from the planet, the night ships scattered and began using hit-and-run tactics, trying to inflict maximum damage while avoiding decisive engagements. Commander Adams led his ships in a series of lightning attacks against the enemy formation. The Solar Templars had perfected these tactics over months of fighting pirates and raiders. They would strike hard at isolated enemy ships, then disappear before the main fleet could respond. But the Kethfor fleet was too large and too well organized. For every enemy ship the Knights damaged, 2 more took its place. The Excalibur, too, took heavy damage in the 3rd attack, and the night ship Galahad was destroyed trying to protect a damaged transport carrying evacuees. By the end of the first day, 4 night ships had been destroyed, and the others were badly damaged. The enemy fleet reached orbit around New Camelot and began demanding surrender. People of New Camelot, announced Admiral Kekstar of the Kethfor fleet, you will surrender immediately, or we will begin bombardment of your cities. Your defenders are defeated. Further resistance is pointless. Troy Adams was still alive, though his ship was barely functional. Half his crew was dead or wounded, and the Excalibur II was running on emergency power. But he was not ready to give up. Admiral Kekstar, Troy replied, the people of New Camelot are under the protection of the Night Orders. As long as any of us still live, we will continue to defend them. If you want this planet, you will have to take it from us. What happened next amazed both sides. Ships began arriving from across human space. Not military vessels or Night Order ships, but civilian craft of every description. Cargo haulers with missile pods welded to their hulls. Mining ships converted into improvised warships. Even luxury yachts armed with hunting rifles and determination. Captain Nicole Pierce brought the cargo hauler Liberty Bell. which she had spent her life savings converting into a transport for refugee evacuations. Veteran pilot Chris Taylor arrived in a modified racing ship he called Lancelot's Lance. Dozens of other civilians came with whatever ships they could find and whatever weapons they could carry. "This is Pierce aboard the Liberty Belle," Nicole announced as her makeshift fleet approached the battle zone. "We heard Commander Adams's call for help. We're not soldiers, but we're here to help anyway." The civilian ships were not built for combat. Most of them had no real weapons and minimal armor. But they had something more important than military hardware. They had the same spirit that had driven knights to defend the innocent for centuries. On Earth, the battle that followed lasted 6 days and became known as the Siege of New Camelot. It was not a battle between professional armies, but a struggle between two completely different ways of thinking about civilization. The HFY Empire fought with overwhelming firepower and careful tactics. They had studied human military doctrine and prepared counters for every standard strategy. What they had not prepared for was ordinary people choosing to die for strangers. Farmer Jim Walsh flew his converted crop duster into a HFY cruiser when his ship's weapons failed. Teacher Maria Santos used her school transport to ram enemy fighters that were attacking evacuation ships. Retired mechanic Bob Taylor kept the damaged night ships fighting by transferring spare parts from civilian vessels, even while under enemy fire. The turning point came on the 4th day, when the HFY fleet tried to break the human line by concentrating all their firepower on the remaining night ships. Admiral Kekstar believed that destroying the military vessels would cause the civilians to flee. Instead, the civilian ships moved to protect the knights. Cargo haulers used their bulk to shield damaged warships. Racing ships darted between enemy formations to disrupt their attacks. Even unarmed passenger transports stayed in the battle zone, using their communications equipment to coordinate the defense. Why do they not retreat? Admiral Kekstar asked his tactical officer as he watched. Civilian ships being destroyed trying to protect military vessels. They are not soldiers. They have no duty to die here. The tactical officer, a young HFY named Sekalon, had been studying human behavior since the war began. "I believe they see it as a duty, Admiral. Not a military duty, but something deeper." On the 5th day, Night Order reinforcements finally arrived. Jake Morrison led a fleet of 40 ships from Avalon, while other night groups approached from different directions. But by then, the civilian volunteers had already changed the course of the battle. The HFY fleet was still numerically superior, but they had taken heavy losses, and their morale was broken. Admiral Kekstar had expected to fight professional soldiers following orders. Instead, he found himself fighting ordinary people who chose to sacrifice everything for others. The siege ended when Admiral Kekstar ordered his fleet to withdraw. The HFY Empire had achieved a technical victory by forcing the humans to take heavy losses, but they had failed in their real objective. They had wanted to prove that human ideals were impractical and that superior firepower always won. Instead, they had shown the galaxy that humans would die for their principles, and that other people would die alongside them. The cost of the siege of New Camelot was enormous. Over 1,500 humans died defending the planet, most of them civilians who had volunteered to fight with improvised weapons and converted ships. But they had saved 2.3 million colonists and proved that the Night Orders represented something more than just another military force. Jake Morrison walked through the memorial garden that the colonists built after the battle. Each stone bore the name of someone who had died defending people they had never met. Farmers and teachers, mechanics and shop owners, all of them united by the belief that protecting the innocent was worth any sacrifice. They knew they probably wouldn't survive, Kate Sullivan said as she joined Jake among the memorial stones. "The civilian volunteers, I mean. Most of them had no military training and minimal weapons. They came anyway." Jake nodded, reading the names carved in stone. 2 years after the siege of New Camelot, Jake Morrison stood before the largest gathering of alien representatives in galactic history. The Great Assembly Hall on New Earth could hold 10,000 beings, and every seat was filled. Representatives from 67 different species had traveled here to witness the founding of something that had never existed before, a galactic government based on voluntary cooperation instead of fear. Jake carried scars from a dozen battles now. His left arm had been broken when pirates attacked a medical convoy near Rigel. A Zephyrian energy weapon had left a mark across his forehead during the liberation of the Tau Ceti colonies. But these scars were symbols of something greater than personal sacrifice. They represented humanity's commitment to protecting others, no matter the cost. The old Galactic Federation still existed, but it controlled less than a third of the space it once dominated. The Kethfer Empire and Zephyrian Collective found themselves fighting brush wars on dozens of worlds as species they had once controlled without question, demanded freedom and protection from the Night Orders. "Friends," Jake began, his voice carrying across the vast assembly hall. 2 years ago, most of you had never heard of the Night Orders. You knew humans as newcomers to galactic civilization, a young species that had not yet learned how the galaxy really worked. Murmurs of agreement came from the alien delegates. The Altarian representative, Elder Veltar, nodded as he remembered the refugee ship that had started everything. The Rigelian council leader, Ambassador Kreltak, thought about the day his people had abandoned the Federation to seek human protection. "Today, we gather not as conquerors and conquered, not as rulers and subjects, but as equals united by shared principles," Jake continued. "We have proven that strength comes not from forcing others to obey, but from inspiring them to choose cooperation." The transformation had not happened overnight. After New Camelot, the Night Orders had evolved beyond simple military organizations. Kate Sullivan had established the Engineering Orders, groups dedicated to rebuilding war-torn worlds and sharing technology freely with any species that needed it. Former Federation colonies that had suffered under years of neglect suddenly found themselves with clean water, reliable power, and communication systems that actually worked. Dr. Alan Foster had helped create the medical orders, which provided health care to any species that requested it. These groups had stopped 3 different plagues that the Federation had ignored and established hospitals on worlds that had never seen modern medicine. Most importantly, the diplomatic orders had emerged to help resolve conflicts without bloodshed. These were humans trained in the ancient arts of negotiation and compromise, skills that the Federation had forgotten in favor of bureaucratic procedures and power politics. The old way of governing the galaxy was based on the idea that some species were naturally superior to others, Jake said, looking directly at the section where former Federation representatives sat. The strong ruled because they could, and the weak obeyed because they had no choice. Ambassador Sektar Vos sat in that section, no longer the powerful figure who had once dismissed refugee ships as acceptable losses. The former Kethfor representative looked older and smaller than he had during Jake's trial years ago. His empire was collapsing as world after world chose Night Order protection over Kethfor domination. "But we have discovered something that the old system never understood," Jake continued. "True strength comes from protecting others, not from controlling them. Real civilization is measured by how we treat the weakest among us, not by how much power we can accumulate." The changes had spread far beyond human space. The Altarians had formed their own version of the Night Orders, called the Guard of the Eternal Flame. These warriors dedicated themselves to protecting refugees and displaced persons throughout the galaxy. The Rigelians had established the Circle of Truth Speakers, diplomats who refused to lie or mislead others, even when honesty was difficult. Even more surprising, some former enemies had embraced the new ideals. A group of young Kethvar had formed the Brotherhood of Scales, rejecting their empire's aggressive traditions in favor of protecting smaller species. Zephyrian rebels had created the hive of individual thought, promoting the radical idea that each being had value regardless of their role in society. Each species that joins our alliance brings their own gifts and traditions, Jake explained. The Altarians teach us about patience and long-term thinking. The Regellians show us the importance of absolute honesty in diplomacy. The Centaurians demonstrate how different cultures can work together peacefully. The Centauri Confederation had been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new system. Their representative, Ambassador Zareth, had worked tirelessly to convince other species that cooperation was more profitable than conquest. Under the old Federation, the Centaurians had been barely tolerated merchants. Under the new alliance, they had become vital coordinators of trade and communication between different species. Jake paused in his speech and looked up at the viewing gallery, where ordinary citizens from dozens of worlds watched the proceedings. Human farmers sat next to Altarian teachers. Regellian engineers shared seats with Centauri traders. This mixing of species had been illegal under Federation law, which required strict segregation to prevent cultural contamination. Today, we formally established the Alliance of Free Worlds, Jake announced. This government will have no emperor, no supreme council, no single species that rules over others. Decisions will be made by consensus among equals, and any world that wishes to leave will be free to do so. The cheering that followed lasted for 10 minutes. Representatives who had spent their lives under authoritarian rule could barely believe. They were witnessing the birth of a truly democratic galactic government. But Jake knew that the real work was just beginning. The old powers had not given up, and there were still battles to be fought. 6 months later, Jake found himself in a very different kind of assembly. The War Crimes Tribunal on Avalon was hearing the case of Ambassador Sektar Voss, who had been captured after the fall of the Kethvar capital world. The former Federation leader was charged with crimes against civilian populations, including the attack on New Camelot and the abandonment of refugee ships to pirate attacks. The prosecution has presented evidence of systematic cruelty and indifference to suffering, announced Judge Patricia Wells, a former human colonial administrator who had been chosen to lead the tribunal. The defendant had the power to save lives and chose not to use it. He ordered attacks on civilian targets and blocked rescue missions to helpless refugees. Jake Morrison served as Sektar Voss's defense attorney, a choice that surprised many people. Why would the founder of the Night Orders defend one of their greatest enemies? Your Honor, Jake said as he stood to address the court, Ambassador Voss committed terrible crimes. He caused immense suffering through his actions and his failures to act. But if we execute him or torture him for revenge, we become no better, and the system we fought to replace. Jake looked at Sektar Voss, who sat silently at the defendant's table. The former Kethvar ambassador had aged dramatically since his capture. His scales had lost their luster, and his yellow eyes no longer held the arrogance that had once defined him. The Alliance of Free Worlds was founded on the principle that every being has value and deserves justice, not revenge, Jake continued. If we abandon that principle for our enemies, we prove that we never really believed in it at all. The tribunal sentenced Sektar Voss to life imprisonment, but also required him to work in refugee camps and medical centers, using his skills to help the people his policies had harmed. It was a revolutionary concept, justice that focused on making amends rather than inflicting punishment. After the trial, Jake returned to his quarters aboard the new Earth orbital station. His desk still held the simple wooden sword that Dr. Foster had given him years ago. a reminder of the ancient knights who had inspired their movement. Through his window, he could see dozens of ships coming and going from the station. Night. Order vessels departed on rescue missions to troubled worlds. Medical ships carried supplies to colonies that had been devastated by war. Diplomatic vessels traveled to negotiate peaceful solutions to conflicts that would once have been settled by force. But most importantly, Jake could see ordinary merchant ships traveling safely between worlds that had once been enemies. Altarian cargo vessels traded freely with former Kethvar colonies. Rigelian passenger ships carried tourists to Centauri resort worlds. The galaxy was finally becoming a place where different species could live and work together as equals. Sullivan knocked on his door and entered carrying a datapad with the latest reports from across Alliance space. The last Federation holdouts on Proxima have agreed to join the Alliance, she announced. That makes it official. We now represent over 80% of known galactic civilization. Jake smiled, but it was a tired smile. What about the remaining? Kethvar, Kanzefarian forces? Still fighting, but mostly against each other now. Their empires are collapsing as more worlds choose freedom over tyranny. Jake looked out at the stars again.